Alrighty, so I want to, before we continue on writing a little more of this code, I want to just be clear and connect the concepts that we've already covered around the core concepts of object-oriented programming. And one is inheritance, and we've already seen this, right? So inheritance allows objects to inherit properties and methods, right, from other objects. Okay, in JavaScript, inheritance is implied using prototype-based inheritance. That's why I was trying to show you that prototype to understand that there is a prototype from which everything is built, and then we can place our methods and some of our properties. Now, in our example, we didn't place any properties there as far as in the class. We set some based on passing it to that, but we didn't do it specifically for static data, which we could as well. Okay, so where objects can inherit them, right, from the prototype object. Okay, so in this case, the class is that template by which we create that, and that's why I wanted you to see the idea of where those methods live. And what I really wanted to drive home, if you didn't get this, was that it's just much more efficient to have those methods setting on the prototype, because then they're not attached to each substantiated object. And then when you want to change something, right, you don't have to go back and touch every object. That's one thing, but from a memory standpoint. Okay, so now let's think about the other thing you can do here is you can create what's called subclasses. Because imagine, right, the other class, right? So here's your first class, and let's create another class called student. Okay, since this is something we're all familiar with. But the key to student is gonna be we're gonna extend person. What does that mean? It means we take, right? First, again, we're modeling the real world because a student is foremost a person, right? But a part of, their life is that they're a student. They could also be a parent. I mean, there's so many roles that we all play in our lives. But in this case, we're modeling a real world idea because certain things, person, right, they have in common. They have a name, they have an address. But students, there are things they have, but it just extends this person class. So in order to use this type of syntax, there's a couple things we have to do. We still have to use, okay, a constructor. We still have to construct it, okay? And we're still going to pass in, right, these, and I'll show you how this works from the way it actually flows. So I'm going to grab those because we're going to see how the syntax is going to change here in a minute. Okay. But in addition to these things, we're also going to pass it an array, and we're going to call it a class list, okay, which will be an array of classes. And then here in the constructor, the first thing we're going to do is actually call super. Now, this will feel like just more syntax, like Rio, why do we need all this syntax? And you'll start to see it as projects grow in complexity. So maybe on the smaller one, it doesn't make quite as much sense. But when you'll see, let me actually just complete writing it and then we'll get to why. So first I'm going to take so super is going to call the parent class, okay? It's because we're writing a new class that says student extends from person. So we first have to say, okay, all the things that a person needs, we have to give it that data. But in addition, now we have this class list, okay? So first we call super, and we have to do that in the way if we're using extends, okay? And then what we want to do is now we're going to say this dot class list would be equal to class list, whatever we're passing in here. So far, right? So this syntax is what we've seen, but the differences are we've seen the constructors, but in this case, we're calling a super. Super means we're passing it up into here. It's going to use this template, And then it'll say, okay, once now that I have a new partially kind of object, now I also have to have it specific to my class that's extended from this one. Okay. All right. So let's just see this in action before we do anything else. So let's come down here. So now instead of new person, we can say new student. And in this case, we need to pass it one more thing. We need to pass in an array. Let's say ing1a. Let's say, how about CIT93, right? For now, two's fine, but we're passing it now, right? Okay, look at that for a minute. So we're calling new student. New student extends person. So the first thing in the constructor, because we're passing in all the values that are sent to the class. But this class says, oh, I have a super, I have somebody I actually have to report to in a way. So let me pass over the required data for the person so I can construct that part of the object. And then come back here, and now I have a class list, okay? So now let's do the same thing for the other person so you can see it. We could still do, let's just keep it this way because you can still see, and I'll end up writing a new method here as well. Okay, so it's actually this. I think that shouldn't create any error. Let's see. Okay, so let's refresh. Okay, and let's look at, right? So now we see that, let me pull this up a little bit so you can kind of take a look at this, right? And you can see this on your side as well, right? So Rio, in this case, is a student class, okay? There is the address, and look at this. The prototype, in this case, is the person class. So this is inheriting, right? The student class is inheriting everything out of the person class. And in addition, we have a little more data, okay? So now the person class, we have the constructor, right? Okay. Person class. Right. So interestingly, and well, let's actually just show you, right? So I can still call show status, which is a method on the person class, even though I've created a student because it was created first from creating that basic template, that blueprint. And then on top of that, then we have the extends that person class for the student. Now you might go, well, then where is this show status, right? So if we drill down here on the object, right? So on the object is the show status because it's within the constructor of the person, then it's the show status there. So now let's write a class for, okay, sorry, method for the student specifically, right? So we could do show status here. What will happen if we have two, right? We have one on the extended, on the sub, we call these subclasses. I should have done that earlier, but these are subclasses. They're also, but the extends keyword, right? It's in the subclass of this. So student is a subclass of person. Okay, so in this case, I could take that same thing, but I would add to it, right? Address is taking, right? And I could do it this way. I could do this class list. Okay. So now let's see this in action. Okay, so let's come down here. Okay. So what's your guess? What's going to happen here when we run this method? Oh, actually, we don't have it yet. So my bad. Oh, actually, no, yeah, we do. On Rio, it does. That's right, because we have the same, it looks like the same method, right? And in this sense, because I've written a new method for the class subclass, right? What will it do? Let's just go ahead and watch it run, right? Let's refresh it. Okay, so status. So it's running the status within the subclass. And what will happen here is if I didn't have this, then it would look up the prototype chain to find it in the parent. But because I have one in the subclass, then it will run whichever one it finds first, and we call that the prototype chain. What it's looking in its prototype chain. So let's go ahead and let this run. Good, right? So now what happens is when we have the next one, which is Jane, and we know what happens when we create Jane. But now when we say show status on Jane, right? Now we're going to run the one that is in here because this Jane was a person class and not a student class. That was a subclass of person. Okay. What do you think of that? Okay. Now, here's what I want. We'll commit this code, but what I want you to do is in your README file now, because I asked you one question in the last video, and now I'm going to do another one. Does this student class subclass now make more sense? Or do you now understand the prototype chain? You can actually answer both of those. The prototype chain, okay? Again, we could just look at the, right? Look at student. Student's prototype is person. Person's prototype is object because everything in JavaScript is an object. Okay, person's prototype. And then if we look ultimately down, this is the prototype that's in the language itself. Okay, because everything in JavaScript is an object. That's really kind of where that meme comes from. Okay. All right. We'll do that. And then I'm going to see because there's a couple things I want to talk about now, which is basically private variables. Because one of the things, let's just do it now. One of the things about this paradigm or this way of writing code that's more complex with the amount of, data we can instantiate is that we want to keep things what we call private or public. And it used to be that that's why we ended up having something called factory functions, so we could try to do that. Constructor functions didn't allow for that. So there's actually a new part, not new, it's actually a couple of years old in the class that will allow us to do that. So in the next exercise, we'll actually pick this up and see how to use public and private fields. All right, see you in a minute.